This is a nonfiction story I wrote quite a few years ago. It fascinated me. It's called The Killing of Rosy Rosenthal. The Gangland murder of Rosy Rosenthal was an otherwise irrelevant small-time gambler in Manhattan. It should have just, this killing, passed into oblivion, but it hasn't. And as long as F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel captures the imagination, we're talking about the Great Gatsby, from one generation to the next. Rosy Rosenthal, the Metropole Hotel, and so forth lives on forever. The Rosenthal case was the most important case in the progressive era in New York. And it brought around the end of a guy named City Police Lieutenant Charles Becker, first law enforcement man to be executed for murder. And that case dragged on for 3 years. It was a big case. It helped to bring down Tammany Hall. Well, not completely, but it did serious damage to Tammany Hall. It purged the New York City Police Department. Now, whether Becker was guilty, not guilty, set up, kind of, sort of guilty, I don't know. That question will never be solved. He was a one-time bouncer when he was a boy in the German-American beer hall. And like Arnold Rothstein and other people who populate the Great Gatsby, he was discovered by a political powerhouse named Big Tim Sullivan. He was this lovable but incredibly corrupt New York City politician. He had served a term in Congress. He was a New York State senator. He also had close ties to Monk Eastman, who was arguably now the most feared gangster New York has ever produced. Becker was brought into the New York City police force in November 1893 under Sullivan's patronage. You could do that in those days. And essentially, he acted as one of the many informers and forces that Sullivan needed to get his way, get things done. If he needed somebody to go and talk to Eastman, he'd send Becker to do it. Becker proved to be a bad apple from the very start in his career. In 1896, he made headlines. This was a big story. He arrested this woman named Ruby Young for prostitution. She was a prostitute. He arrested her for prostitution. It was, in that instance, a false arrest. Even though Young admitted to being a prostitute, he was extorting tribute from these people, from these streetwalkers. It was common. It was what a lot of cops did in their salad days. The women simply paid. It wasn't worth going to court and everything else. But on this day, Ruby Young, the girl, she's not plying her trades, and she says, "I'm not going to pay you. I'm not going to." So he arrests her. Becker arrests her. So the man accompanying her at the moment on the street that day was Stephen Crane, the writer, the novelist, and a great American novelist, who was then working for Hearst, New York Journal News. And he was doing a story about girls on the street. He was changed his name to, he wrote The Red Badge of Courage. I guess I should mention that. It's a great book. It was originally a short story. Anyway, he wrote this thing called Maggie, A Girl in the Streets. And it was a story about how a young Irish immigrant, this girl Maggie, is forcing her way out of the world of prostitution. He made her look a little bit better than she actually was. So anyway, they goes to court, and Crane testifies that Becker tried to extort money from Ruby. He was there. He saw it. She refused to pay, and she was locked up. The magistrate, this guy Robert Cornell, released her immediately. Remarkably, Becker, it's in all the headlines now, goes unpunished because of Big Tim Sullivan. Nothing happens to him. The next year, Becker, depends on who you talk to, mistakenly shot and killed an innocent citizen while Becker claimed that he was chasing a burglar and nobody else saw the burglar. It's kind of weird. So to cover up the mistake, he accuses the dead guy of being part of the burglar's gang. Then the truth gets uncovered, and Becker was proven to have made the story up. He was given, listen to this, a 3-day suspension sentence, and that was only for lying to his supervisor. One guy said Becker, as a cop who worked with him, would raid his own crippled grandmother if he thought he could make him look good at headquarters. As an example of that mentality, in 1904, Becker was awarded a medal for heroism for leaping into the North River and saving a man named James Butler from drowning. 2 years later, it was revealed that Becker had promised to pay Butler, who, in Butler, he told the newspapers, considered himself an, quote, excellent swimmer. But he paid him to jump in the river so he could save him. The reason Butler stepped forward and told the stories. Becker said, I'm going to pay you $15, a lot more than it sounds like today. And he didn't pay him. So he went to the newspapers and said, look, this is what happened. Once again, and again, thanks to Big Tim Sullivan, Becker just goes completely unpunished. I don't blame him for doing these things. I mean, he never gets in trouble. Over the next few years, he's investigated several times, mostly for brutality and false arrest. But in each case, the charges are dropped against Becker, and he walks away unharmed. So in 1906, Becker is now a sergeant, and he's placed in charge of a politically motivated squad that works out of police headquarters. This is incredible. That's supposed to probe allegations of corruption against a police inspector, a guy named Max Schmittenberger. So Becker's orders were clear. If he could find anything against Schmittenberger, he had to create a law, and they wanted to bring him down. Schmittenberger's only crime was giving a truthful testimony during the 1894 Lexlow Commission, which was looking into police corruption. And that was it for him. They were just out to get him. So Becker did his job based on the evidence that he either collected or he manufactured or both. Inspector Schmittenberger is convicted of corruption and removed by force from the office. The thankful police commissioner, this guy named Rhinelander Waldo, he was played by James Cagney in a movie that came out in the 70s. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, he's the driving force behind this Get Schmittenberger squad. And he rewards Becker by making sure he's the bagman, the bribe collector for the precinct captain. It's a very, very good job. You should have that. So like all the bagmen, Becker gets 10% of the gross he collects. The graft he's collecting, he gets 10% of that. Very lucrative. And it brought him $80,000 in the first year. $80,000 in, what was this, 1910, 1911? My God. So Rhinelander Waldo becomes police commissioner in 1911. He promotes Becker again to the rank of lieutenant, and he appoints him to be the anti-vice squad leader. His sole assignment is to break up massive street gangs that control lower Manhattan. Well, you have to know, some of these gangs, a small gang numbered in the hundreds, some of them were hundreds and hundreds of guys, and Tammany employed them to bust up their competition, get rid of it. So this is breaking that wasn't going to happen. Anyway, Becker is told to clean up Times Square, then known as Longacre Square. It was also called the Tenderloin. It was this area extended from about 23rd Street over to 42nd Street and 5th and 6th Avenues. The area, which now is, we know it as the Garment District, oh Lord knows that's disappearing. It was a haven for prostitutes, thieves. It was not a nice place. City Hall gave Becker carte blanche to clean up the area. Just do what you got to do. Crackheads, we don't care. Put people in jail. The local businesses want these people out of here. Do what you got to do. So he and his men, they were called the Broadway Squad. They corralled prostitutes in the area and pushed them. This is estimated 30,000 streetwalkers. I don't know whose estimate that is. 30,000. Further away from Times Square. The pickpocket and petty thieves were tossed out as well. So all that's left of the gambling houses, we're not going to close that down because City Hall will tolerate this because you can make a pretty hefty kickback from a gambling house. So these all-night houses, they popped up along 42nd Street, and the area became known as the Roaring Forties. Lasted until the 1920s, until Prohibition made things. So they were virtually gone. The speakeasies took them over during Prohibition. For a man like Becker, this guy had no natural moral or ethical stops. The power to extort money from gamblers was like a license to print money. Becker's salary was minuscule. It was almost nothing for a man in that position for that rank, a lieutenant. He made about $183 a month. Actually, that was pretty good for the day. But he managed to save, records showed, $70,000 that same year, so figure that out. He had a reputation, although he had this reputation as being this brutal, completely corrupt cop. He was 40 years old about this time. His superiors and everybody else said he was highly intelligent, extremely disciplined, never drank, he never smoked. He was loyal to his wife, stayed away from hookers. His wife was Helen Lynch, who was a special needs school teacher. At the time all this was happening, when he was tried for murder, she was pregnant with her second child. But at his base, he was a hustler. He was an ambitious overachiever. He grew increasingly more corrupt, if that's possible, with every day. And more corrupt he became, the more arrogant he became, because he was the law. there. And the guys above him who were supposed to regulate him all the way up to City Hall, he was putting money in their pockets. They're not going to bother him. So Becker, subcontracts his extortion thing to this gangster named Jake Zelig. He was born Harry Lefkowitz, who was a leader in the Eastman gang and so forth. So it was the same gang, by the way, that Al Capone and Johnny Torrio sort of graduated from. So Zelig, who was called the most feared man in New York, was taken over the Eastman gang when Eastman is sent to Sing Sing on a robbery charge. Since then, the Eastman's membership has dropped to about 120 members. It's not what it once was. They thought it was about at least 1,200 people at its height. So Eastman gets released from prison. He's banned from the gang's leadership for taking over the gang that bore his name. Instead, Zelig, who was basically a pickpocket, who was not the... It just that he was more businesslike than Monk Eastman. Monk Eastman would hit first, talk later. So Zelig takes over the gang. He starts to rebuild it. And he's busy, and Becker hands him this chore to collect all the money. So he subcontracts it again to this guy named Harry the Jip Horowitz. I'd like to have a name like that, the Jip. Lefty Louie, Dago Frank, and Whitey Lewis. That's his crew. So things are going well until this it's obese, glitzy, loud character. His name is Herman Beanie Rosenthal, Rosy Rosenthal. And he decides to open a small casino in the middle of Becker's territory. Well, Herman Rosenthal was born in the Baltic provinces of Russia. He arrived in the U.S. when he was 5 years old, about 1879, settles on the east side in these steaming, huge Jewish neighborhoods. He leaves home at 14. He runs a runner in a pool room. He'd go do favors for guys who wanted a cigar. He'd go get him one. And eventually, he too fell under the spell of Big Tim Sullivan. This guy, Big Tim Sullivan, had an eye for talent. He eventually became a bookie, and in 1909, he opened up a gambling den at 123 2nd Avenue and 39th East 7th Street, directly in competition with these really connected hoods who keep having Rosenthal places shut down. So he reopens again at Far Rockaway, but again, he's in competition with some organized gamblers there. They have the place raided by the state's attorney's police. He doesn't give up. He relocates again, this time to a brownstone at 104 West 45th Street. I don't know if that's still there. I'm going to have to look. The casino was in the building's basement, and Rosenthal and his wife lived upstairs. So compared to dozens of gambling dens that were surrounded, his Rosenthal operation was small, but it was respectable. He was known to pay off when he lost. And anyway, it brought him to Becker's attention because it's making money. A few days after Rosenthal opened up his shop, Becker strolls in. He tells Rosenthal that he's now a 20% partner in the casino, and that every now and then he'd have to conduct a false raid. It was just one of those things. He needed to make district attorney happy. Don't worry about it. He said also, as part of this required protection packet, Rosenthal was told to bring in a character named Baldy Jack Rose. He was said to be the best poker player in New York, as a partner in the casino, and Baldy Jack would front for... Baldy Jack was from Waterbury, Connecticut, by the way. He would front as Rosenthal's guy to keep an eye on things. So he comes across this name, by the way, Baldy Jack, because he had typhoid when he was a kid. It left him hairless. Eyebrows, no eyelashes, no hair on his head. So added to that oddness is the fact that he's overtly feminine in his speech and in his manners. So Baldy Jack would watch over Sullivan and Becker's shares in this casino. Baldy Jack was born Jacob Rosenwick. He was the primary collector. Things were done on an ethnic line. So the ethnic Jewish house, Baldy went and collected from the Jewish gamblers in the Times Square area. He's a professional card dealer. He would take a 25% cut of the $600,000 in graft that Becker collected. He went around and got Becker's money. So Rose was also a partner with Becker. Becker was a silent partner in this loan sharking business, which was really considered absolute bottom of the barrel in those days. It was just In fact, even the mafia kind of avoided it until the 40s. Chicago, I understand they avoided it until the 50s. I don't know if that's true, but it was just considered a slimy business. Prostitution was a step above that. On the first night of the operation, Rosenthal, this guy named John Freeman comes in. He drops $6,000. He scoops up $2,800 of that money, the $6,000 that the gambler lost, and he puts it in his pocket. Well, Baldy Jack sees this and he says, "You can't do that. That's our money. Put it back." There's a big argument, and Rosenthal solves the argument by throwing Baldy Jack off the property. Sure enough, a few minutes later, a policeman comes around. He says, "The boss, Becker, wants to see you tomorrow at Pabst Saloon." Pabst Saloon was this really, Pabst beer is famous in that part of the world, but on 59th Street and Broadway is a really well-known bar, big place, beautiful place too. So the next day, Rosenthal shows up at Pabst at the time he's supposed to show up. There's no Becker. He goes back home. Becker had raided his home/casino, ruined him, smashed everything he could. And before he left, he told Rosenthal's wife, "You tell Herman he and I are even now." Whoa. So to Becker's amazement, Becker's now expecting a regular payment. Rosenthal refused. He won't be extorted. He refuses to pay, which is, in those circumstances, was just crazy. But so Becker responds by saying, "All right, fine." He places a patrolman 24 hours around the casino, nobody in. So remarkably, Rosenthal went to court and he asked the judge to give him an order to have Becker remove the cop on the grounds that they were depriving him of his income, which was gambling, which was illegal. So understandably, the judge says, "Look, I can't do that. I can't. You're asking me to help you break the law. That's not going to happen." Rosy Rosenthal, completely frustrated. He files a complaint and he launches this PR campaign against Becker. Becker's really well known up and down Broadway at this point. He gave an interview, Rosenthal gave an interview to the World newspaper. It was a very popular paper in the day, and he says, "There is only one man in the world who can call me off of this campaign. That is the big fellow, Big Tim Sullivan." And listen to this. "And he is as honest as the day is long. And I know that he is in sympathy with me. He don't want to see nobody hurt. My fight is with the police. It's purely personal with me. I am making no crusade, and my friends know all about it. I'm not going to hurt anyone else. And if I can't go through with this without bringing anyone else in, I'll quit." So Rosenthal arranges a press conference at his casino, and there was a policeman who saw the reporters, ran inside the lobby of the casino, and Rosenthal locks him in and points him out to the lawyers, to the reporters. Anyway, the cops show up and they bust down the door. Well, that allowed Rosenthal's lawyers to sue on a federal level, since the casino was in Rosenthal's home. You just can't enter a guy's home without a warrant or without due cause. I would think the due cause would be, you blocked a cop in your house, but it wasn't. So they print the story about the kidnapped cop, but they not a single word, and he said it over and over again, about the 10 grand a month that Becker was collecting from gamblers. But then scuttlebutt is going around and it reaches District Attorney Whitman. Whitman was the grandfather of New Jersey, former governor of New Jersey, Christy Todd Whitman. So he's in Newport, Rhode Island on vacation. He comes back to New York. He's not happy. He's got to address this thing because it's a big stink. So the first thing he does is he agrees to listen to Rosenthal, listen to his accusations. Rosenthal at this point is on really thin ice. That same year, there was this gambler named Mick Alfie, who testified about the gamblers and grafts to the police. He was arrested as soon as he made his testimony. They put him in a cell and they beat him to death with nightsticks. Then the gambling community, they close ranks on Rosenthal, and they tell all their customers, "Look, avoid this guy. You go over there, you're probably going to get arrested. Just stay away from it all." So Rosenthal won't give up. He meets big embarrassment with the newspaper reporters and Rosenthal and everything. Becker goes to the Union Square Hotel, where Baldy Jack sits at a table behind the newsstand so he can't be seen by the general public, and people come there and drop off the graft for Becker that he collects. In an effort to calm things down, Baldy Jack says, "Look, why don't we I know some guys will act as an emissary. They'll go to Rosenthal and they'll ask him to cut you some slack. Just back off for a little while." Well, Becker, at this point, his ego is through the roof, and he screams across the room, "Do you know who I am? I'm going to ask somebody, I'm going to lower myself to the point where somebody like Rosenthal, I have to go ask him to let up on me?" So that didn't work out. But Baldy Jack gets Becker to go and see Big Tim Sullivan, who is normally the arbitrator for these underworld disagreements with guys that work under him. They meet with him at his theater, and Sullivan is still coherent at this point. He says, "Well, look, why don't you just pay him? Give him some money, ask him to go away for a while. When things have calmed down, we'll have a meeting. We'll see if we can work this out." So Becker says no, he leaves. But later on, Sullivan gets Baldy Jack. He gives him $6,000 in cash. Becker doesn't know any of this. He gives him $6,000 in cash. He says, "Give it to Rosenthal. I want him to be quiet." He doesn't give it to him right away, and there's another meeting a few days later with Becker, Baldy Jack, and Sullivan. Now, Sullivan, at this point, he was suffering from untreated syphilis, and he's delusional and he's paranoid. So by the time they were supposed to have the meeting, his family has him judged mentally incompetent, and they commit him to a private mental asylum. So Baldy Jack pockets the money. And Becker says, "All right, I tell you what, let's kill Rosenthal and get it over with." He tells Baldy Jack, "Go see Big Jack Zellick, who's in jail on a gun charge at the Tombs." And he goes and sees him. And Becker and Zellick says, I can't get involved. But A, I'm in jail. B, I don't know if I want to go that far. This is a very loud case. A lot of people are looking. He went back. Baldy Jack went back. He told Becker what happened. And Becker said, "Good, fine. Let him rot in the Tombs. Who needs him?" So at that point, two members of Zellick's gang, and probably Baldy Jack, approached them, paid him on this. One was Lefty Louie and the other was Whitey Lewis. They're opium addicts. And he told them they would be arrested by Becker's squad the next morning for carrying concealed weapons. Lefty Louie says, "We don't carry them no more since the big trouble with Zellick," which Baldy Jack says, "Well, it don't make no difference. Zellick didn't have one on him either," implying that Becker's men planted the guns, to get him off the street. At this point, Becker is fed up with Baldy Jack. He figures he's not going to get this murder done. And Becker's already said, if he isn't dead tonight, I'll kill him myself. But he didn't do that. He went to this guy named Bridgie Weber, Lewis William Weber. He was known as Bridgie Weber. He was a drug dealer, and he was an avowed enemy of Rosenthal's. Weber, he got his name Bridgie because he lived with an Irish immigrant named Bridget who ran an opium den on Pell Street. Anyway, this animosity between Rosenthal and Weber, it went way back several years. One of Rosenthal's collectors and the casino bouncers was the murderous John Lewis, better known in crime history as Spanish Louis. He was a Sephardic Jew. He was very dark, hence the name Spanish Louis. On one occasion, a lot of people, by the way, during Spanish Louis' lifetime had no idea who the hell he was. Spanish Louis, that's all they knew about him. So on one occasion, Rosenthal sends Spanish Louis to wreck Bridgie Weber's casino and put it out of business because they were stealing his customers. To the shock of the upper and underworld, Weber files a criminal complaint against Spanish Louis, and he forces Rosenthal to pay Weber $900 in damages. It was a lot of money, $900 at that time. Several days later, Spanish Louis probably got to thinking about this. He attacks Weber and his living girlfriend at their house, beats them both pretty bad with a blackjack. So for revenge, Weber finds Big Jack Zellick, he's the gang leader, and he pays him to send a crew over there and return the beating. Whitey Lewis, Gyp the Blood, Lefty Lewis, they all go to Spanish Louis' place. They're supposed to work him over. Who knows what happened, but anyway, Spanish Louis ended up shot to death. Weber organized a meeting at the Lafayette Baths with Becker, Dago Frank, Ciro Fica, Harry Fallon, Lefty Lewis, and Baldy Jack Rose. So at the meeting, one of the Baths employees, this guy named James Marshall, he later testified he heard Becker say, "If that bastard Rosenthal isn't croaked, I will croak him myself." And Marshall later testified for the prosecution in Becker's case. What the prosecution didn't tell the jury is that Marshall was a lifelong criminal. He had a long record. He was a gambler. He probably had some business interests with Rosenthal. He should have told them, but anyway, it didn't happen. So it was agreed that all the criminals were there would be paid by Weber $250 each for killing Rosenthal. $250 is a lot more money than it sounded like. A lot more money. Later, Becker took them all out to a Chinese restaurant, and he gets word that Rosenthal and his wife, they're dining a few doors down at the Garden restaurant. Becker gets up, he walks by the Garden restaurant, but he sees men around in suits, and he figures, well, they're bodyguards, and we'll get them another day. On the night of July 15, 1912, Rosenthal is interviewed by the District Attorney Charles Whitman. Rosenthal left the meeting around 10:30 p.m. at night with the comment, "You'll find me dead one of these days, and you'll probably find they planted a gun on me. They'll get me for sure." And Whitman laughed it off, and he says, "You have nothing to worry about." And Rosenthal was very serious. So you can laugh it off, but I know what I'm talking about. I don't mean to say that a patrolman in uniform will step up and put a bullet in me. They don't do things that way. But they do have ways to get their own, to get it done. So before they part, Whitman advises Rosenthal that the charges he's levying are huge and he's going to need a witness. And Rosenthal says, "Well, what about my wife?" And Whitman says, "All right, fine." And he agrees to meet them the next morning at 8 a.m. at Whitman's home. At that point, Whitman was living on 37 Madison Avenue. So the DA assures Rosenthal that if his wife can corroborate the stories about Becker, he will convene a grand jury that day. Around 11 o'clock, they walk home, and Rosenthal gets a message from someone, his wife wasn't sure who it was, that they needed to meet him at the Metropole Hotel, about a block from his house. Although the call more than probably came from Baldy Jack, who told him Becker wanted to meet him, or maybe that's what it was. But anyway, he goes there. Rosenthal, he's dressed in a black suit with a black and red striped shirt, wow, with yellow buttons. He walks to the Metropole. He arrives around 1 o'clock. His wife is crying at the door, "Don't go, stay here, they'll kill you," and he laughs it off. So the Metropole was set to close due to bankruptcy in 6 days. It was located on Broadway and 42nd Street, only feet from Times Square. It was secretly owned by Big Tim Sullivan and fronted for him by a pair of gamblers named Jim and George Constantine, who were close with Arnold Rothstein, the big boss, big gambling boss. George Constantine had once managed the heavyweight fighter James J. Corbett, and Kid McCormick, a remarkable fighter. By the way, the building where the Metropole was is today a bank, and there's no place where the door had been as a ATM machine. I went over to check it out. The partnership that owned the hotel, the Constantines, also owned Miners Theater on the Bowery and a saloon on 6th Avenue called the infamous Lobster Palace. That was a big deal. Lobster oysters were all the rage at that time. The hotel is tiny. It's 60 by 100 feet, 6 stories high, 50 feet from Times Square Center. It has a 24-hour, thanks to Big Tim Sullivan, 24-hour drinking license and an all-night dining facility. So they keep it filled constantly. It's got a variety of interesting, quirky Manhattan night owl types. Cole Porter actually wrote a song about it called Ace in the Hole. I'm going to put the music here for you. That night, there's a Hungarian band. They're playing the Turkey Trot. Every light in the room is on. There's enormous fans, and they're blowing a pleasant breeze across the hall. Rosenthal walks into the dining room, and all the gamblers who are there, that's their haunt, they all get up and leave. They just don't want to be seen talking to this guy. Rosenthal is carrying a late edition of the newspaper. Can you imagine there was a time when you can get morning, afternoon, night, and late night editions of a newspaper? Wow. Technology took care of that. That was technology, actually. So Rosenthal walks to the back of the cafe, takes a table for 4. He orders a horse's neck, which is, I understand, bourbon, a twist of lemon, and a ginger ale. And he has 3 large Havana cigars. While he's there, these 2 gamblers, Boob Walker, an occasional bodyguard for Bridgie Walker, and Butch Kitty and Fat Mo Brown join him. How are those for names? Fat Mo Brown and Butch Kitty. Anyways, humid night, choking humid. Rosenthal told the men that he was waiting for a New York World reporter, a Pulitzer Prize writer named Herbert Bayard Swoop. It was the same reporter who later on would coin the term Cold War, which means a lot to baby boomers like me. Rosenthal said he had promised Swoop the story of the century. Turns out Swoop didn't know anything about it, and he more than probably was waiting for Becker. That's what the call was about. Probably Baldy Jack said, look, come on over to the Metropole, sit down with Becker. I'll referee the meeting. We'll work it out. Anyway, and why did he say he was a reporter? Because he was, that's what these guys do. They blow themselves up to something important. So a few minutes before 2 o'clock, they order a pot of coffee, rather, and Bridgie Weber walks in, and he strolls right past Rosenthal's table. And oddly enough, he says, hello, Herman. So Rosenthal is taken aback by this because these two hate each other. But Bridgie was very pleasant. And after all, Bridgie, who sold narcotics, I think I said before, Rosenthal had actually paid somebody on another occasion to have him killed. So he's taken aback, but Rosenthal says, hello, Bridge. Weber strolled in and out of the cafe, took a seat in the lobby next to Harry Valen, who's an opium dealer from Chinatown. Valen and Weber were partners in this very lucrative poker game on the northwest corner of 42nd Street and 6th Avenue. They were also partners with Becker in several Struss houses. Struss is like a simplified version of Faro. What's Faro? I don't know. Bridgie Weber is now heading up this hit operation, this murder scheme they've got going on. There's an awful lot of people here. And he turns to Valen and Lefty Lou and he says, look, Rosenthal's inside now. And he pointed him out to them because they didn't know what Rosenthal looked like, although their world was small. I'm surprised they didn't know what he looked like. So just to be sure, Valen flags this waiter and he sends him over to Rosenthal's table. And the waiter goes to Rosenthal and he says very loudly, hey, Herman, someone's outside looking for you. So that Lefty Lewis walked outside and said, the squealer's on his way out, and the gunman got ready. They were out on the sidewalk. Lefty Louis, Rosenberg, is 23 years old. He's one of the shooters. The other one is a guy named Sam Sheps. He was an opium dealer described by police as intelligent, a smooth talker, neatly dressed, considerable jewelry, constant frequenter of theaters, associate of sporting men, which is not what it sounds like, vaudeville actors, etc. In other words, low-life. Those people were considered just racy, sort of low-lifey people. Accustomed to good living, spending much time in Turkish baths, and is an insistent cigarette smoker. Schweppes was essentially a flunky for Baldy Joe. Most experienced member of the hit team is this guy, Dago Frank Sirofisi. He was called the toughest man in the world, who knows, by very tough people. He was suspected of 6 murders by 1920. Very dangerous guy, unpredictable even in his own circles. People avoided him. Sirofisi worked mostly as a stick-up artist and when needed a killer for Big Jake Zellick. Sirofisi's girlfriend, known as Dutch Sadie, carried a butcher knife in her belt, and she worked with her boyfriend on occasional muggings. He was a very dangerous guy and the most experienced killer in the gang at this point. All of them were members of the Lenox Avenue gang in some way, shape, manner, or form. They came in and out of the gang, which was run by Heritage at Horowitz. Sort of. He was a nominal leader. The gang started in or about 1900, was made up essentially of pickpockets, burglars, second-story burglars, that sort of thing, and then they answered to Jake Zellick, when he took the Eastman gang. With a Cuban cigar in his hand and newspapers under his arm, Rosy Rosenthal strolls across the lobby, stops to talk to people, past these enormous potted plants. He walks out the front door. Harry Valen says, over here, Beansy, which is what they call Rosenthal. And then 3 shots ring out. Although there were 3 men with pistols, only one, Lefty Rosenberg, was firing, and he shot high. The first bullet missed, buried itself in one of those large wooden door frames on the hotel. The second one struck Rosenthal in the face and passed through his right cheek, shattered the teeth out of his mouth. A fragment landed in his neck, and a third centered on his skull, into his skull. The killer was so close that when they fired that shot into Rosenthal's face, the skin was burned by a muzzle flash, and someone yelled out, probably the shooter, Rosenberg, gotcha. Rosenthal was thrown backwards, and then with his hands covering his face, he screamed for a little while. He fell down on the sidewalk and then died. So the gunman's car swung to the sidewalks. The killers leaped in the car. The car is driven by this young guy, Billy Shapiro. He's 20 years old. He works as a collector for the cop, Becker. They get in the car, they zip off. An off-duty policeman, Billy File, is a former sparring partner with Gentleman Jim Corbett. He'd recently been reduced in rank from detective to patrolman because he was lying to the district attorney. He's in a hotel, I think probably as a plant. Now, the district attorney thought so as well, for Becker to run interference if anything should happen, because he's a legitimate cop. File said he rushed onto the sidewalk and he drew his revolver and he sees the bad guys going away and he flags down a cab with a patrolman named Brady and they give chase to the fleeing killers. But District Attorney Whitman later said the whole thing was just a little more than a pretense to a pursuit. Among other things, File gave the investigating officers the wrong license plate number, but Whitman, who arrived on the scene, had the correct plate. Officer Brady and the cab drivers had written it down. And that was, File got in a lot of trouble for that. Never got kicked off the force. So a crowd rushes out of the Metropole, dozens of people, they scurry all over Times Square. They're coming in to see what happened, what was the big deal. A man in a hat, probably Baldy Jack, stepped over Rosenthal's dead body, bent down and said very loudly, "Hello, Herman." Then straightening up, he smiled and he said, "Goodbye, Herman," and he disappeared into the night. So that's kind of weird, isn't it? The first reporter on the scene was the famous Alexander Humphreys Wolcott. He was covering the police beat at the time for the New York Times. Wolcott was the inspiration for the character Sheridan Whiteside in The Man Who Came to Dinner, and he would go on to help form the infamous Algonquin Round Table Club, where theaters would sit, and he did theater reviews later. Wolcott had seen his share of murders, and he wrote, "I shall always remember the picture of that soft, fat body wilting on the sidewalk." We're talking about Rosenberg now, Rosy Rosenthal. "And I shall always remember the fish belly faces of the sibilant crowd, which sprung into the twinkling from where formed a clot around the clamorous ruins. Just behind me, an old-timer whispered the comment, which I have more or less heard on one occasion to repeat. 'From where I stand,' he said, 'I can see 8 murderers.'" It was just general chaos on the street. There's at this point about 100 people. They're trampling all over the place, close to the body. Jimmy Constantine, who was Big Tim man in the Metropole, had a waiter cover the corpse with a sheet. An ambulance arrives 20 minutes later. They tend to say, well, he's dead because most of his brain was on the sidewalk. And they think he was dead, according to the Times, before he hit the ground. I don't think so. He was screaming when he hit the ground. A doctor named Homer, who lived nearby, came out, and he tried to inspect what was rest of Rosenthal's skull, but he just said, well, this guy's, forget about it, he's dead. Someone screamed from the crowd, well, he got his, and everyone laughed out loud over that. So Shapiro drops the gunman at the corner of 49th and 3rd Avenue, then returns the car to a garage in Washington Square. Bridgie Weber, Baldy Jack, they meet Becker outside the Murray Hill Bass, and Becker says, "I congratulate you. It was a good job. I was in the station house after." He continued on by saying he was deliriously happy that when he saw Rosenthal's body, he felt like reaching into his pocket, taking out his knife, and cutting his tongue off, and he said, hanging it up as a warning to other squealers. Boy, this is one intense human being. With the correct license plates, the police tracked down the car easily enough and established the same car used during a drive-by shooting of gangster Jack Sirocco's cafe the week before. That alone should have tipped off the police that Jack Zellick was tied to the murder in some way. In 1911, Sirocco left wounded Jack Zellick behind during a failed bank robbery. He also refused to post bail for Zellick and then tried to take over the Eastman gang while Zellick's recuperating or in jail. But Zellick, using his substantial political connections, had the charges dropped. He walks free from this. In December 1911, Sirocco sent an assassin to murder Zellick, but the plot was found out. Zellick murdered the assassin instead. This power struggle went back and forth until Zellick died in fall of 1912. The cops arrested the car's owner, Louis Libby, and dragged him from his bed down to police headquarters. New York Times reporter who saw it said they gave him an intense third-degree questioning. I can imagine they did. Minutes after the questioning began, Libby didn't hold up much. He said he gave the name Billy Shapiro, the driver, and all the other information he had. A squad tracked down Shapiro. They interrogate him. And the same reporter wrote, if the grilling of Libby was stiff, there were no words to describe the cross-examination which the police put Libby's partner. So in other words, they knocked him senseless. But Shapiro wouldn't cooperate. The murder in Rosenthal's talk with the DA and the tie-ins with Becker was splashed all across the papers, first in New York, then across the United States, then across the world. Charles Becker was arrested for Rosenthal's murder on July 29th. The arrest came largely as a result of testimony by Baldy Joe Jack Rose. Jack Rose saw the writing on the wall, and he knew this whole thing was going to collapse. So he went to the district attorney in an attempt to save his own life and just gave him everything they could possibly want. In fact, where Shapiro would have gone into hiding. So now they've got all this. The DA's case, in the meantime, is getting sabotaged by guys on the police department, Becker's friends. They're hiding evidence, making people disappear. Just a matter of time, the DA Whitman figured that another witness in the case would be dead, probably Becker. So he was frantic to save his case. Whitman started to cut deals in exchange for information. So without conferring with his staff, he offered Rose, Weber, Valen, Shapiro immunity. All they had to do was cooperate. Immunity for murder. Shapiro confessed that he drove the car to Metropole. He identified the killers as Louis Lefty Rosenberg, Frank Dago Fisi, and Jacob Whitey Lewis, Seedon Schemer, and Harry the Gyp Blood Horowitz. Baldy Jack gave up Becker and squarely pinned just about everything he could on Becker, more than what was reasonable. Baldy Jack did a lot of stuff. He just denied he did anything. He just gave it all to Becker. Jack Rose testified that Becker told him he, Rosenthal, ought to be put to death. This is a fellow I would like to have croaked. Have him murdered, exclamation point. Cut his throat, dynamite him, anything. Further, Baldy Jack said that Becker's request was to recruit all these guys, and they would be paid $10,000 for the murder between them. They'd split it. Why Becker, this hands-on manager, this obsessive guy, would give this enormous contract to somebody like Baldy Jack is nobody knows. I mean, Becker had more experience in dealing with this criminal element. Baldy Jack Rose wasn't a street criminal. He was a gambler. He owned amateur baseball teams. He was more of a businessman who liked to gamble and take dumb chances. Why he was involved with this thing at all is who knows. Largely, Becker indicted himself in this. He said he was on his way home. He lived on 161st Street in the Bronx, and he'd driven down Fifth Avenue. He just happened to be driving down Fifth Avenue, across Broadway. He passes the Metropole Hotel at 1:50, and he sees Rosenthal killed. So there's a lot of people who believe that although he certainly was guilty of a lot of things, Becker wasn't really guilty of ordering Rosenthal's murder. The theory is that Rosenthal's testimony would harm all these street-level hustlers, and it would harm Becker, but Becker, he'd get by. He had political friends. He wasn't worried. And that District Attorney Whitman, in this theory, was aware that Becker was technically innocent, but he saw the conviction of murdering, this conviction of murdering cop would get him a lot more political influence. And it did. Whitman was eventually elected governor and went on to a lot of things. So is that true? Possibly. I mean, it could be. The answer is in the middle someplace, I think. I think Becker certainly wasn't in charge of this thing from top to bottom, that's for sure. But everyone just thought, well, it's just easy to blame this guy, and that's what they all did uniformly. There's a second theory that says that Rosenthal met with Whitman, the DA, and didn't really provide him any information. It was just to send him the meeting with Whitman, just to send a message to Becker to back off. Most who knew Rosenthal, they agreed that he never intended to give up information. He just didn't want to pay extra protection money. So instead, they suspected Rosenthal was actually shaking down Becker for $15,000 in cash and a promise to leave town, and that the reason Rosenthal walked back to the Metropole that night was to meet Becker to get the payoff money. So in other words, Rosenthal has a witness that Becker's trying to shake him down. He takes that evidence to the DA. He's going to take it to the DA, and he tells Becker, you better straighten up here, because if you don't, I'm going to rat you out, and you'll go to jail. And give me $15,000. I'll leave New York. It'll never happen. A lot of people doubt that. Rosenthal's wife, she alleged her husband had gone to Metropole to meet with Becker, but she refused to testify to that in court. So I think she just wanted Becker dead. In the meantime, everyone's in fright. The police department, City Hall, the underworld. This is not good. These are big names going to jail. So casino owners, fearing the worst, they pick up their equipment and they run out of the city, and they flood over to New Jersey and Connecticut. Nobody knew what would happen next. Becker and Baldy Jack Rose, they knew plenty about the system of the pay-and-play system in New York. If they talked, the foundation of the city, up to the mayor's office, probably would end a lot of things. So the prosecution rested its case in his testimony. That big Jack Zellick, who was supposed to have been spotted by two policemen talking to back Baldy Jack Rose. But on the evening of October 4, from the prison where he was being held in protective custody, Baldy Jack Rose told the state prosecutor, Zellick will never see the trial start. Watch. He'll be the first one to go. And he was right. 4 hours later, on the day when he was supposed to testify at the trial, Big Jack Zellick was at a party when Philip Davidson, a thug for hire, basically. So they're at this party. Davidson pushes Zellick or something. There's a fight. It gets broken up. The next day, during a card game at Siegel's Cafe, Davidson starts to pester Zellick. Zellick reaches over. He slaps Davidson across the face, throws him out of the saloon. A few hours later, Zellick boards a streetcar. Davis walks up behind him, fires a round into his head, and he kills. There's no witnesses, nothing. He's captured a few moments later. Davidson, I had to kill Zellick. I had no choice. So who knows what that was about. He claimed that he had been kidnapped and beaten up by hoods who wanted Zellick dead so they can keep him from testifying at the Rosenthal trial. Nobody, by the way, believed that story. I think he just saw it as the trial and so forth as an opportunity and took advantage of it. It's more likely Zellick's enemies, and he had a lot of enemies, arranged for Davidson to take the fall. He pled guilty. Davidson pled guilty, second-degree murder, served 12 years of a 20-year sentence up in Sing Sing. Zellick was the last of the leaders of these great, massive gangs that used to roam New York. They all just fell apart after that. Yeah, by that time, the Eastman gang was sort of a dinosaur anyway, and it ceased to exist. The Lenox Avenue gang ceased to exist after the trial. Becker's guilty conviction, his original trial, was overturned on the grounds that the trial judge, John Goff, who was a Fenian hero, an hero of the Irish Revolution and all that, had been biased against Becker. Well, so there's a trial, retrial in 1914, and then reconfirmed the conviction. A crafty defense lawyer probably could have kept Becker out of the electric chair. But after the jury learned that the cop was pocketing 20 times his annual salary in graft, they reasoned, he could probably commit murder to protect that sort of money. He was found guilty a second time. He's sentenced to death at Sing Sing. So he's on death row, and Becker starts to earn the respect of his fellow prisoners because most of them were illiterate, and he begins reading cowboy stories out loud to pass away the time. So he's well liked in jail. Following the conviction, Judge Goff sentenced Gyp the Blood, Lefty Rosenberg, Dago Frank Ciro Fisi, and Whitey Lewis. His last name is Seaton Schemer, so we'll just call him Whitey Lewis. Sends them all to death in the electric chair as well. On April 4, 1914, the four of them were executed at Sing Sing. Their deal with the DA before all this just they didn't hold up to it. The public wanted blood, and so all deals were off. Before he was executed, Dago Frank told the reporter, "So far as I know, Becker had nothing to do with this case. It's a gambler's fight. I told some lies up on the stand to prove an alibi for the rest of the boys." That November, the former New York District Attorney Whitman, now he's the governor, largely because of the Rosenthal case. He refuses to grant the pardon for Becker. So on July 13, 1915 at 5:30, Becker becomes the first American police officer executed by capital punishment for murder. When he was asked if he would apply for leniency anyway, Becker said, "I'll not ask for any quarter. I will not appeal to Whitman. I am ready to meet my maker." He really didn't like the guy. Again, the appeal would have been pointless anyway. Becker didn't realize his wife had already gone to Governor Whitman and asked for it and pardon, but Whitman turned him down. He said, "My real sorrows for you." His legitimate concern was, how could Whitman, who's governor, be impartial to grant a pardon, to decide whether or not Becker deserved a pardon? And to a degree he did, because all these guys had come forward and said, look, we lied, Becker was involved, not that involved. So because Whitman had been essentially the prosecutor in the case. So Becker sits in the electric chair, and he says his last words, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Unfortunately for Becker, for the reporters who were there to witness the thing, the first jolt doesn't kill him, and it just burns him badly, and it was apparently horrible. There's a second vault. It was just gruesome to watch, is what one reporter said. Finally, 8 minutes after the first jolt, he dies due to a third jolt. So imagine that. In August of 1912, Big Tim Sullivan, this political boss who got things going here, he's being held in a mental asylum by court order. But he bribes the orderlies, and he escaped outside for several hours before he died of natural causes. They found him sprawled out across some railroad tracks. He had been nearly severed in half when the trains from the old New Haven line ran over the body. Because the orderlies had failed to report him missing, Sullivan's body went unclaimed. This was a huge, important guy. In the end, he was scheduled for a pauper's grave in Potter's Field, which is a pauper's, until somebody recognized him, an off-duty cop recognized him. Over 25,000 people attended the wake, the funeral. He was the last of the Tammany Wildcats, and his death marked the end of the organization, really, which had limped along, and it would still continue for another 20 years, but then it would collapse. Bridgie Weber would spend the rest of his life certain that Charlie Becker's friends were going to kill him. The police were going to kill him. He changed his name. He fled to Cuba. Then he returned to northern New Jersey. He opened a box manufacturing company, the Garfield Paper Company. And he did well with his life. Unfortunately, he died suddenly at age 59 from natural causes. Sam Paul, who paid for Rosenthal's funeral, was probably the brains behind the murder of Rosy Rosenthal, so say some, died of natural causes in 1927. He was the target of ceaseless arrests and raids by the police, certain that Becker, that this guy Paul had framed Becker for Rosenthal's murder. By the time Paul died, the tiny empire he had of pool halls, diners, cafes, and so forth, they were all gone. The cops just put too much pressure on. Sam Schweppes, who was one of the ships, actually, who was one of the gunmen, was arrested for forgery in 1933. He was convicted, sent to prison. When he was released, he became a prosperous jeweler and antique dealer, and he died in 1936. Harry Valen, one of the men who fired the shots into Rosenthal, managed to go low, and he was living under an alias in Pittsburgh, from what everyone hears. He disappeared. He went into oblivion after 1915. Baldy Jack Rose bought a wig, and he went on a speaking circuit across the United States. He was a big, huge star. It talked about the evils of gambling and what happened and what really went on in that trial and so forth. He died in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he was from, in 1947, 72 years old. Rosenthal's wife made a series of really bad investments with the money. He left her a substantial fortune. She died bankrupt. Becker's wife had a plaque nailed onto the coffin before it went underground, and it read, "Charles Becker, murdered July 30, 1915 by Governor Whitman." Whitman had it taken off because they said it was libelous, and it was removed. Wow. Who would have seen it underground? What did it mean? Becker's infant son, Howard, he went on to become a university professor and sociologist of considerable note. Their daughter, Charlotte, conceived shortly before Becker was arrested, died less than a day after her father was. She died of natural causes. Less than a day after her father was died. She's buried next to him at the Woodlawn Cemetery. A few months after the Rosenthal murder, the Constantine brothers sold their interest in the Metropole and went into business with Arnold Rothstein as financial backers of a massive gambling house known as the Holly Arms Hotel out on Long Island. The Metropole was dying anyway. The Times Square neighborhood was changing for the better, really, and the Rosenthal murder just drove the place bankrupt, and the hotel closed. For a while, it was reopened as the Yates Hotel. In 2008, it was reopened as Roosevelt's Hotel, housed, fittingly enough, former convicts. I don't know what it is today. There's a restaurant downstairs on the street level.